Well, hey there, Aletheia Church. Just want to spend a few minutes recapping my sermon from this past Sunday, which I have entitled Unashamed, where we looked at 2 Timothy chapter 2, verses 8 through 18. And one of the things I started off our sermon by saying was just trying to get us to think through the opportunities that God opens for us to share the gospel sometimes, and maybe why in those opportunities do we maybe shrink away or not share the gospel with somebody. And I think one of the things that we talked about on Sunday was that typically those tend to be tied to situations where there is a fear of man, or a fear of not knowing what to say, or a fear of not knowing how to point somebody to God. And so we get into these situations where we become paralyzed and we don't share the gospel. And I said that as we're studying 2 Timothy, what we're seeing is this is Paul's final letter to Timothy, where he's trying to encourage Timothy to really continue this legacy that Paul had started at this church in Ephesus. And the first thing that we see in these verses is Paul saying to Timothy, don't be ashamed. Right? And he shares with him first to not be ashamed of the gospel. And the second thing he tells him to not be ashamed of is of Paul. And he says to Timothy, the reason that you can continue to preach and teach and share the good news the way that you do is because God has given you power, He has given you love, and He has given you self-control, just like we saw back in verse 7 of this first chapter. And then he calls Timothy to, instead of running away when things are difficult, or when he is afraid that he might be ashamed or that he's not equipped enough, instead he turns to Timothy and he says, Timothy, share instead in the suffering for the sake of the gospel by the power of God. Saying that there are going to be times when we share our faith where it may even feel or appear or actually be suffering, but that God has saved us and has called us not because of our own works, but because of His righteousness, and because of the finished work of Jesus, who abolished death and brought life. We need not be afraid. I think what we see here is this great work by Paul to call us out and say to us, hey, let's put our trial, let's put our fears, let's put our hesitancy to share the gospel into perspective. It's nothing in light of a holy and capable God. Do not be ashamed, because God is better. This isn't a call to buckle down and do better, but it's a call to remember that God has given us a holy calling and has promised to empower us to be the church. The second thing we saw in that encouragement that Paul is sharing to Timothy is not just a call to not be ashamed of the gospel, but also a call to imitate the boldness of others. And he calls Timothy to imitate both his boldness and the boldness of a man by the name of Onesiphorus. It's a tongue twister. But basically what he's trying to get us to see is that Paul's entire life was marked by suffering and trials, and yet God had done so much through the ministry that Paul had done throughout the Roman world. Church, what would it look like for us to rest in the same type of confidence that Paul displays here as he writes to Timothy? If we truly believe that Jesus was faithful, even if sharing was uncomfortable, because God is faithful. One of the things we saw all the way back in Acts chapter 1 is that Jesus declares that we will be His witnesses, but that He will be faithful to that mission. And we see that God has been faithful even some 2,000 years later by the fact that our church exists, and that we get the opportunity to partner with God as we move forward trying to make much of Him. And so tonight in Gospel Community, I hope that you'll be open and honest about why it's difficult maybe to share your faith, I hope you'll talk about strategies and ways that we might be able to encourage one another. I hope you'll spend some time reflecting on how good God is. And maybe we'll even talk about some of the examples other people have set for us in the ways that they share our faith. Ultimately, I hope that you will pray for your one and that you will look for opportunities to share your faith with them. I love you guys. I'm praying for you. Have a great week. Go and be the church.